Out of Shasta College, Humanities 2. How you doing? It was only a cool 107 today, going up to 111 tomorrow. We're not out of that heat wave yet. Hope you're staying cool and hydrated. I'm going to sign a paper today. I'm going to talk about the writers I want you to write an essay about. Uh, we're doing literature this week and 20th century literature for the most part. Some 21st. I'm going to throw in some 21st stuff, Margaret Atwood, and who's still writing in her 80s, and J.K. Rowling's, who wrote the Harry Potter books. But I'm going to start off with John Steinbeck, who was a phenomenal writer of the 20th century, early 20th century, mid to the 60s. He died in, I do believe, late 60s, and wrote some of the most profound fiction of its time, of any time. Grapes of Wrath would be his most famous, East of Eden, Of Mice and Men, Tortilla Flats, and so many more. He had an ability to write about the common man in very sophisticated lyrical style writing, meaning it had a poetry sense to it. Very easy to understand and read, and very profound. Um, if you ever want to read a profound book, read Of Mice and Men. It's a small book. Maybe you read it in high school and hated it. Well, you should read it again. Or Old Man and the Sea. Um, he had a way of putting humor into our tragic lives that has never been matched. He won the Nobel Prize for writing in his day. He, you could choose him as one of your papers to write. And they've made many movies from his novels, like Grapes of Wrath with Henry Fonda, made by the great John Ford. East of Eden, which was James Dean's first, the actor James Dean, his first movie, made by Elia Kazan. Profoundly moral and ethical. East of Eden is essentially the retelling of Cain and Abel for the Bible. It's about two brothers who are totally different, and they're at also has a King Lear aspect. If you know Shakespeare's King Lear, it's about an old king who's dying, and his three daughters are vying for their inheritance, but he only truly loves the one daughter. And of course, he eventually goes completely mad at the end. That's the tragedy of King Lear. And there's a King Lear aspect to East of Eden. The father is a tyrant, but he's fair. But he's not a loving father. He doesn't show emotion, and a stroke takes him down. And it's profoundly what happens to you when you no more longer have the ability to speak or get out of bed. And now what are you going to do? And so, John Steinbeck, if you ever head down to Monterey, you ever been there? There's the John Steinbeck Museum. Steinbeck wrote his most famous books were set in down by Monterey and the Salinas Valley. Grapes of Wrath. The people from the Depression of the 30s, they come out to be to pick fruit and vegetables in the San Joaquin Valley, and there thus is the story is set. East of Eden is set there also in Salinas. If you've ever driven down by Salinas, which is about 4 or 5 hours south of here on 101, you'll see all sorts of signs about Steinbeck. He's an important figurehead in that whole area of 1930s America. In the 1950s, a whole new crop of writers showed up, led by Jack Kerouac, who wrote a book that changed literature called On the Road. And was called beat literature. They were called beatniks, and Kerouac and others like Allen Ginsberg and Michael McClure were writing beat literature, which was really popular in the 50s, along with jazz music. And these are guys that came out of World War II and were disillusioned, and they didn't know what to do with their lives. They didn't want to go work a regular job. They didn't want to have the picket fence or the two kids, blah, 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 which was expected of everybody in those conservative times. Eisenhower was president, but art flourished. The art of Willem de Kooning, the paintings, and Jackson Pollock, Andy Warhol, the music from Miles Davis to Elvis Presley, Little Richard thrived in the 50s, conservative times, but it was a great times for art. And the plays that were being written in those days, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, Cannon Hot Tin Roof to Streetcar Named Desire to The Death of a Salesman, defined an era of mid 20th century America that really hasn't been surpassed. The art that came out of post World War II, the first 10 years, is incredible. And we're building the country. Highways, freeways, the first freeways are being built. So that's the cultural aspect of these artists. And so people like Jack Kerouac took a road trip before there was freeways, folks. Highway 66, maybe you've heard of it, maybe you've been on there. And he drove it in these beat up jalopies, and they hung out in bars and in restaurants, and they worked on farms, and they did manual labor, and he wrote about it as they listened to jazz, and they're hopped up on methamphetamine pills and marijuana, and they're living like there was no tomorrow. They're seeking for some kind of transcendence that regular life, so-called whatever life, wasn't giving them. So Kerouac wrote On the Road, and Allen Ginsberg wrote the famous poem Howl. That changed the course of literature forever, actually. That was the 1950s. As we get into the 60s, brilliant writer Kurt Vonnegut wrote his Cat's Cradle, Slaughterhouse-Five. These books were really hip and funny, profound, and the college kids of the 60s really picked up on him, and they made him a must read. You read all of Vonnegut's stuff because it was that profound and funny and tragic. Slaughterhouse-Five is Kurt Vonnegut was captured in World War II by the Germans, and he was put to work in a place called Dresden, Germany. He was put to work in a slaughterhouse. That's where they housed him, a former slaughterhouse. That's why it's called that. And during his time there of being essentially forced labor, our allies, us, bombed the holy hell out of Dresden, and it had no military purpose at all, just payback to Hitler. It was a beautiful city that mostly specialized in making crystal figurines. That's what it was known for. And as payback for Nazis messing over the whole world, England and the United States, we leveled Dresden. Vonnegut was down there. Prisoners of war were down there, and they survived it. And then they had to come up top and clean it up. 100,000 dead bodies, women, children, civilians mostly, and they had to clean it up. And he wrote this great novel called Slaughterhouse-Five, which had made into a movie. George R. Hill directed it. It's a surreal journey about Billy Pilgrim and how he survived the war and what he did after the war. And it was must reading when you're in college. the 60s and 70s, Kurt Vonnegut was a must read, along with others, Philip Roth and Philip K. Dick and so many others, but I can't cover all those. Fiction, folks, that's what we're talking about here. Fiction writing. That means made up stories about the truth. Not to be confused with nonfiction stories, which are usually based on a real story. Something that, but Slaughterhouse 5 happened to Kurt Vonnegut, not the whole thing. In a Billy Pilgrim is approached by aliens, and he's a time traveler, and he travels to a planet, and he travels back down to World War II. Then he travels to his life in America, and he lives a really mundane life with a boring wife and boring kids. When he's in World War II, it's exciting and deadly, and when he's on the planet, he has a beautiful girlfriend who mostly walks around naked all the time, and it's like heaven on earth, but it's a different planet. So that's where the surrealism, the playfulness comes in Vonnegut's writing, and lots of kids in those days are reading it, smoking pot, dropping acid, and they really related to it. Although Vonnegut didn't do any of those things, he's from an older generation. They mostly smoked cigarettes and drank liquor. Then to get some women in there, we have Margaret Atwood, who is still writing. Her I mentioned her the other day. She's a Canadian writer, and her writing is usually set in the future. It's not sci-fi. It's what they call speculative fiction, what could be. And her Handmaid's Tale uh, was a phenomena of women being held down and only made to breed the races, and they had no education, no jobs, no, they weren't supposed to have an opinion. They were just breeders, and it made into a very successful TV series that was, I think it's off the air now, but I think it was on for 2 seasons. And she is still writing speculative fictions, and she's well into her 80s, pushing 90, with a uber, uber feminist point of view. Then there's J.K. Rowling, who was a success story that we haven't seen for maybe never. She was a mother, unwed mother of two, living in a van. Had no money. She had no way of support, so she wrote a book called Harry Potter. And the rest, as they say, is history. It became a huge phenomenal bestseller, and she wrote several more and made her a very, very wealthy woman. You see, there's always hope, even when you're living in a van down by the river. And recently, she's gotten into some trouble, controversy. You can write about that. She doesn't like the whole trans movement. She thinks a man's a man, a woman's a woman, and that's it. And so she's gotten a lot of flack from the trans community and the gay community um, over her ideals. Now, would we pay attention to it if she wasn't famous? No, we wouldn't. But she is famous. And so a lot of things what she says, I've listened to it, I don't agree with. It's her opinion. Um, why she took a strong stance on it, I have no idea. But she has her own personal reasons. You can write about it. Maybe you've read the Harry Potter books. Maybe you've read Handmaid's Tale. I don't think you've read On the Road, Kerouac, or John Steinbeck, but that's why I'm asking you to write a paper about them. Learn something about them. Read some of their writings. It's all online, folks. Go to Wikipedia. Don't copy anything. Don't do a copy and paste job. You know I don't like that from Wikipedia. But um, look at some of his work. Read a couple of paragraphs so you at least know what the hell why you're writing it, why these authors matter, and they still matter, and how literature, novels, works of fiction tell our story. From Stephen King to John Grisham, to all the popular writers, bestseller writers. They're telling our story in different genres. It could be science fiction, could be murder mystery, could be criminal, true crime. Um, it's all out there, and it's all in fiction. And it's the best of who we are as humans on the planet Earth. From Shakespeare writing Don Quixote, like I mentioned the other day, who was writing 600 years ago about us, our human condition. We haven't changed. We're still desire the same stuff. We're still looking for meaning. Only thing that's changed is the technology. Now, the technology, we're being overwhelmed with it. Now, AI is going to take over everything, and who knows what the next phase is. Does that bother you? Does it bother you that an artificial intelligence might write the next great novel? It bothers me because it takes away who we are as humans and gives it to a computer world. But computers do design the computers. Right now in Hollywood, they're in protest. The writers are protesting. They're on strike. The screen actors, the actors are on strike this week because they're being replaced. They're not getting the paychecks they feel they deserve. The, 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 the guys who run the companies, they're all getting millions and millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, and it trickles down. Yes, Tom Cruise does great. I'm not talking about that kind of acting. You're a television actor on a series on Netflix. That's what we're talking about here. The fair play, and they're starting to feel threatened by AI replacing them. Computer generated images is going to replace maybe flesh and blood actors. They Hollywood would like that. You don't have to pay them anything. You don't have to feed them. You don't have to buy them a fancy house or a car because they're essentially non-existent. They're an intelligence made by computers, programmed by computer people. So that's where we stand on that. Reading fiction, reading at all, anything you read, is a discipline. It's like learning to play music, you have to practice it. It's like learning to paint, you have to practice. You might want to be a musician, or do you want to be a celebrity that does nothing? Like so many are now. What did Paris Hilton do? She has no talent. She's not writing songs. She's not. At least Taylor Swift has songs she writes and sings. What did so many of these don't have anything? What do the Kardashians do besides get surgeries to increase their boobs and their butts? I mean, besides that, what exactly do they do? Hmm, you tell me. Anyway, so writing fiction used to be everybody going to college in the 50s, 60s, and 70s wanted to be an author, a writer. That doesn't sell so much anymore because with the media we have now, most people don't have the discipline to read anymore. It's a loss. It's dying in a way, the art, but there's still a ton of writing programs out there. There's a ton of people who are taking pen to paper and writing their story. We all have a voice. You have a voice. Your story hasn't been told, or the idea of the story in your head hasn't been told. So I say get out and tell it. Don't get discouraged by saying it's all been told. It hasn't. There's a bunch of stuff to tell. Stay creative, stay cool, stay hydrated. I'll see you next week.